In the summer of 2020, my friends Alex and Violet and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. COVID cabin fever had hit us hard and we were desperate to get out. We settled on a mountainous estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet bought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, and it was tucked in her bag as we pulled out of the driveway to make our way to the cabin. I remember this knot in the pit of my stomach, this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way we could drop acid that night. Violet was pissed. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled toward the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites. Just a long, winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk gave way to night, we heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road, then the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, climbed the fire tower, and left. We'd heard there may be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside, heated some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast, and sat in the silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you're in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to white noise living in the city, there's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. Here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of our own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another, and finally, I'd had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, and slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen, and we were laughing, having the raucous good time we'd envisioned. Much soberer than we'd thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd all recall hearing noises in the background, the snap of a twig, the dim rumble of an engine. None of us wanted to rupture the air of nonchalance between us, so we ignored it. Until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it 3 times. We were screaming in an instant. Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed pokers from the fireplace and passed them out. Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was, whatever this was, would have heard us call the police, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived 20 minutes later, a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing. They suggested it may have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We'd barely cooked those hot dogs, and why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids rather than the one closest to the pan we'd used to cook? Why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers, but they had one anecdote. As they'd sped to us, they'd come across a car at the base of the mountain, but that was the only sign of life they'd seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they'd said, and dizzied by a new horror. Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by our drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places we hadn't. We grabbed our shit by the armful and threw it inside, eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain. We followed the police, grateful every pothole found us further and further from that wretched cabin. We made it down in record time and found lodging at a seedy hotel that reeked of cat piss. I couldn't sleep. The thought of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember? There was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top, no pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower. Maybe a visitor decided to spook us during their late-night excursion. But the kids from earlier, we'd seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way. They didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence and secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare. They'd planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me. I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night of terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit in calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service. It had certainly been a welcome surprise to us. Perhaps that was a wrench in his plan, enough to spook him before he could make things ugly. This happened about 2 years ago. I had just moved about an hour and a half away from home, the first time I had lived away from home. I was working on a kids' activity camp. All the staff lived in 2 massive cabins in the woods. There were about 40 people in each, 2 or 3 to a room, so you can imagine how big this cabin was. Anyway, everybody became really close. Some people knew each other from previous years working at this particular camp. None of us really locked our doors because we all knew each other, and everybody hung out in different friends' rooms all the time. On this camp, my job was working with the kids during the day and doing evening shifts on the bar, which was there for the staff and the teachers and parents that had come with the children. One night, my roommate and I were both working an evening shift on the bar. She was finishing a couple of hours earlier as she was on a different shift. My roommate, Debs, decided that she was just going back to the room to read and wait for me to finish so we could watch a movie. She had been gone about 5 minutes. That's how long it takes to get from the bar to the cabin, when my phone started ringing with her caller ID. I picked up the call, as the bar was pretty dead that night, and the only people in there were staff. When I picked up the phone call, nobody was saying anything on the other end. I put this down to her just butt dialing me by accident and hung up. About a minute later, I get another phone call from a friend that lived across the hallway from us. She told me that I needed to come back to the room now, so I asked the guy I was working with to cover while I popped back to the room quickly. I walked down the hallway and there were about 5 people just standing outside of my room. I walk inside and Debs is just standing there crying, which isn't like her at all. Our stuff was all over our room. Please note this is very weird because I'm pretty sure I have OCD and often tidied my side and her side of the room, even if she didn't want me to. She went on to tell me that her phone had gone missing. I then asked her about phoning me before I came back to the room and she had no idea what I was talking about. This means someone had taken her phone and knew who to call straight away. Also, when she left work, there would be no point in stealing her phone as it was literally worthless. $10 mobile at the most. A few days later, we started noticing that things had gone missing, but not normal things people would steal. They could have taken laptops, Kindles, a PlayStation, and games. Instead, all they took was my bra and knickers, some clean and some from the dirty washing. This made me feel sick, especially because we knew everyone that we lived and worked with. For a few days, I kept getting these phone calls from Deb's phone with just silence on the other end. We obviously went and reported it, and our bosses said they would look into it. We kind of got blamed for leaving our door unlocked, which I understand as being really stupid now. The creepy thing was, a few days later I walked into the staff lounge, and Deb's phone was just placed on the windowsill. Nobody was in there and nobody seemed to be around. Well, at that point I noped out of there as fast as I could and locked myself in my room until Debs came back. Nothing ever came out of it and we never found out who it was. But I definitely have a feeling it was someone that knew us quite well and who knew when we would both be out of our room. For the life of me, I still don't know who stole my underwear, my roommate's phone, and who trashed our room. But I have definitely learned a lesson, and that's not to leave my door unlocked because there are gross creepers out there. A couple years ago, my friend Kate had asked me to go with her to a party. This party was being thrown by her friend Susan. Kate had gone to Catholic school with her in elementary and middle school, but during high school, Kate ended up going to public school, where she met me, while Susan went to a Catholic high school. The two had grown somewhat apart and hung out with different people, which is why Kate invited me along. It was Susan's birthday, and apparently Susan's parents had decided to rent out a cabin for her. They did this for her the previous year, and unbeknownst to them, she had decided to throw a party. The party had been a hit, so she was planning on doing it again. Kate and I drove to the cabin together. The cabin was pretty isolated. Aside from the woods behind it, there wasn't anything around. We couldn't even see other cabins, but I imagine they would probably be empty because it was winter time. I was a little apprehensive because I wasn't going to know anyone at the party, but I figured after a few drinks that wouldn't really bother me anymore. Also, if you watch scary movies, you know that having a party in a cabin in the woods is a horror movie cliché. I was very aware of that. Kate and I had even been joking about how attending this party sounded like a prelude to a horror film. As if that wasn't enough, this was a Catholic schoolgirl party. We arrive at the cabin, and it is pitch black outside. We needed to use our phones just to find our way. We go inside. Everything seems fine. Birthday girl is having a fun time. There's a good amount of people. The odd thing is that there seems to be a strange sort of divide at this party. Kate and I were completely unaware of what was happening. I did happen to notice this classy guy who had the name of the city we lived in tattooed in a messy scrawl across his neck. Kate and I had been silently laughing about it, but we were also a little worried because we wondered if that meant he was in a gang or something. Anyways, I don't remember why, but the main group of the party wanted these people to leave. I think it had to do with them drinking a lot despite not having brought any alcohol of their own. So in order to get these people to go, the main group said that a ranger was coming to stop by and there were only supposed to be like 2 cars by the cabin and a handful of people. Rumor was that one of the guys in the group was on probation and couldn't afford to get in trouble. They left. The plan was a success, or so we thought. Just as the group leaves, there were about 4 or 5 guys and 1 girl. The girl comes back in and says, "I just want to tell the birthday girl happy birthday," in a really loud voice, drawing everyone's attention. Everyone was staring at her in confusion. Why was she announcing this? When not even 2 seconds later, we hear a window in one of the back rooms being busted open. This continues on and more windows are being broken. People are shouting and screaming. I'm just sitting there in confusion. Kate and I had been at this party for all of 15 minutes before all hell broke loose. And the girl who had invited the group of hoodlums is now saying that she knows at least one of them has a gun. Great. I don't know if my mind wasn't processing all of this correctly or what, but I'm just sitting there thinking, welp, this is happening. The majority of us remained in the cabin. A couple of people went outside to see if the group was still there, and after a little bit of time had passed, people began to leave. There was still some fear that those guys might be out there waiting, but a lot of people just wanted to get out. I remember 3 girls who had been planning on staying the night had gathered all their stuff up, their arms were full, and began heading out the door. As soon as all 3 walk out, we hear screaming coming from the woods, and all 3 girls immediately turn around and walk back in. One of the girls proceeds to start crying. Luckily, the scream had only been that of a new girl arriving at the party. She had seen her friend outside and had screamed in excitement. Kate and I had stayed at the cabin for a couple of hours. We really didn't want to leave Susan alone, and the majority of people had left at this point. Aside from us, there were only a couple of other people left in the cabin. Thankfully, those people were staying the night, so Kate and I were able to leave around 2 a.m. We had all debated calling the cops, but considering the underage drinking going on, no one really wanted to. Plus, Susan was worried about her parents finding out about the party and had decided she was just going to lie about how the windows had been broken. Thankfully, the group of potential gangsters did not return.